primarily, viewing marketing as a provisioning process for our society. 50 years later, that definition essentially persisted for 50 years. In 1985, a new definition under Bob Lush, who was on this program today, but couldn't be here. This was actually the head of the group that did this. And you can see this is more the 4P sort of notion of marketing management coming as a central notion. And also exchanges, which was very significant at that time. Then in 2004, Professor Lush was asked to come up again and review that definition, and they suggested a revision and came up with this one. Now, there were also some things that occurred during that process. I'll get to that for a second. So a few observations. Notice that if you looked at those definitions, you see the focus on marketing has narrowed specifically over time. But until 85, it was quite pluralistic, and it easily translated to aggregated issues, such as competition, system performance, and consumer welfare. In 85, we saw a clear turn of focus to managers' tasks. That made aggregate perspectives a little more difficult, but they're still feasible with that 85 definition. The 2004 definition definitely extended the narrowing spirit, and there was a sole focus on the individual organization. And the head, actually I saw Greg, is he here? I saw him before. But he was the head of the AMA academic division at that time, and he gave a quote that supported that this was a strategic orientation to the definition. So some of us were not happy at all with the 2004 definition because it in my opinion, it defined the rest of the field away and told us that marketing was really about what a manager does. And my reaction was, this is not that that's wrong. I mean, that may be a fine definition of marketing management, but it's not a definition of the field of marketing as a whole because it wiped out my interest in aggregated marketing. So I didn't like it. Other people didn't like it, including, thank goodness, Shelby Hunt. And so we organized some sessions at AMA conferences. AMA was nice enough to allow us to have these special sessions, and they were extremely well attended. Some of you may have been in those audiences, and they were pretty spirited. And the president of AMA, Deborah Ringgold, was sitting in one of the sessions and told me later that while she was sitting there listening, she realized that the speakers were correct and that the definition probably needed to be reviewed. So she organized a committee to review the definition. Under Don Lehman was the head of the committee, and they made sure to appoint Shelby and myself. They knew we were critical of that, and so they expected we would be advocating changes. And the committee worked really well. We did a survey of the membership of the association, and 23% of AMA members, we had a couple thousand people respond. I mean, the response rate was pretty surprisingly good. And 23% rated the 2004 definition as poor. And our committee suggested an alternative definition, which was rated better than that by a fair amount. And so, and I want to give, Shelby never seems to want to receive credit for this, but I have to say that he was the main force defining marketing, and that's only appropriate, and I'm very pleased with the results. My concern was that the aggregate get back in there, that the view of marketing as a field be represented by its definition. And I would be very happy if AMA wished to have a definition of marketing management as a separate entity. It does have a definition of marketing research, and it would seem to me that it's feasible to do that, but they haven't done that yet. So this is just sort of background that the field, left to its own devices, the field, I think, would choose to focus in more and more and more on marketing management. That part of the field that's actually interested in marketing, which is another question I want to raise at the end. Now, in terms of what I've been doing, I used to be a graduate research professor working with a number of PhD students. That was sort of my job at the University of Florida. And I liked it a lot. It was great. I chose to return to the University of Notre Dame, where I had gone as an undergraduate, and try to build research there. And they don't have a doctoral program at Notre Dame, so I couldn't work with doctoral students anymore. So I was walking across campus one day, and I'm not built so that I feel light, but this day I'm sort of floating along feeling light. And I'm saying, what is this? And I might not have been carrying a briefcase. That probably was a help, but it was, hey, I don't have to do anything for any doctoral students anymore. I can study what I want. This is pretty great. I don't have to run these experiments because that's what they need to get published. And so I began to say, well, what is it I want to study? And I've been in marketing my whole life, unlike many of us. I actually was a marketing major. Jerry McCarthy, who did the 4 Ps and book, was my first marketing professor. And I did marketing in my graduate work, and I've been a marketing faculty member all these years. And it was occurring to me that I didn't really understand what marketing was. And as I got older, I sort of understood it less as I watched our field take it on. And so I thought, well, that would be a worthy challenge to, before I die, figure out what is marketing. And I threw anyway in just to make it a little more fun. So we've been looking at this for a lot of years now, and mostly interested in how we as academics try to conceptualize our field. And so there are a couple papers I want to recommend. If you haven't looked at them, I think papers like this should be in doctoral programs. I know they are in some, but they're probably not in most of them. The Millennium issue of the Journal of Marketing was, as you may know, that was a great effort, I think, by George Day and Bob Lush was the editor, and George Day and Dave Montgomery were the editors of this special effort. They tried to address significant basic questions in our field. And Betsy Moore and I worked on what does marketing contribute to society? We tried to conceptualize the answer to that question, which was interesting, took a long time, and challenging. And in 2003, we actually started the 1999 paper with a brief. We wanted to have about 3 pages of history. And so I started sketching that out, and I had 10 pages and wasn't even close. And it wasn't very cuttable, so we just moved it out of the first paper and made it a separate paper. And it's 31 pages, which I hope is the longest paper. I don't know if it is, but if it is, that'd be cool. And that's in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing in fall 2003. And in order to do that, we tried to conceptualize what have been the periods, the essential periods of marketing thinking, academic marketing thinking, which extends about 100 years, a little over 100 years now. And so we came up with the idea of the 4 eras, and I'll show you those in a second. Then the definition of marketing period, and we have some articles about that. And right now we've been working on a really tough one. Why is marketing controversial? Very interesting, but a very big question. So hopefully that'll come out sometime soon. Now, I wanted to give you a taste for the aggregate marketing system, which is one way we can take a larger look at our field. And I know I'm supposed to be quick, so I'm going to only give a taste, but you can certainly go to the paper if you'd like to see more. 2 of the background issues we ran into is that actually it's hard to see a lot of what goes on in marketing because it's hidden from view unless you're participating in those activities. And so that creates a challenge then for us understanding and appreciating all the things that marketing actually does. And second, in business schools today, we don't tend to be looking at marketing as a larger system. And so we created something we call the aggregate marketing system, and beginning with an illustration that make it a little easier to think about. So we called it Breakfast at Tiffany's. We used movie themes all through the paper. And thank goodness George and Dave allowed us to do this. I think we just argued that it would be more interesting to read if we had vignettes in there that are not in the style of a normal journal article. So Breakfast at Tiffany, we have Tiffany Jones sitting in her apartment with her family having breakfast in New York City, and she's blowing across her cup of coffee, and she's wondering where did this coffee actually come from. And so we borrowed an approach that had been used in a great book in 1952 by Vail, Grether, and Cox, Marketing in the American Economy, a truly brilliant book, I think. And they had looked at a system for breakfast, and so we went and found out a lot of details from coffee manufacturers about exactly how coffee gets constructed and delivered. And I'll just go, not take much time with this. We have painstaking detail in the paper with each of these steps. And I've left the sailboat in because my co-author is very anti-war, and we only had 2 pictures available at the time we were doing this slide. We had a sailboat and a battleship. And she refused to allow me to use a battleship, which I thought was much more appropriate, at least it was large. And I said maybe we could paint out the guns, and she wouldn't have it in any form. And so she insisted on a sailboat, and so there's the sailboat. And then the first time we delivered this, it was at a workshop at the University of Illinois. And one of the people in the audience raised their hand and said, by the way, I'm a sailor, and your boat's going back to Columbia there. It was headed to New Orleans, but we have our picture going back to Columbia. So I leave it in there to hopefully one day my co-author will apologize. And we're all familiar with all this, but when you look at each step, you realize there's a lot going on, and it's all with marketing in mind at every stage of the process. So we call this a marketing system. And by the way, this conception of marketing systems is what marketing academics were doing until the field began to change in the 50s and 60s. So it isn't a strange way of thinking about marketing at all. It's a very normal way to think about marketing, but it's not the way many of you probably have been taught to think about it. So we then just, to make it, because coffee is actually a pretty simple product, so now we look at a more complex product, and you begin to see how the system gets even more elaborate. And we went to a major food manufacturer and learned about a new